רגע, אבל השם יניב פוקס, ככה? אז אני רוצה להציג את דוקטור יניב פוקס, מרצה בכיר במחלקה להיסטוריה כללית באוניברסיטה באנגלית. I didn't practice it. It's too many words that I want to say, זה לא יהיה טוב.
אוקיי, הייתי יודע מי אני.
אוקיי, אז מרצה בכיר, אני מתנצלת, מרצה בכיר במחלקה להיסטוריה כללית באוניברסיטת בר-אילן, עוסק בהיסטוריה של שלהי העת העתיקה וימי הביניים המוקדמים במערב. ספרו העוסק בגליה המורובינגית, יצא בהוצאת אוניברסיטת קמברידג' ב-2014. לאחרונה סיים את כתיבתו של ספר נוסף, העוסק בהיסטוריוגרפיה של התקופה המרובינגית, וכיום הוא חבר בקבוצת המחקר במכון לימודים מתקדמים בירושלים, העוסקת בטומאה וטהרה בתרבות וחברה בשלהי העת העתיקה וימי הביניים, ביחד עם... אז את רוצה להוסיף? את רוצה שנתחלף? נראה לי.
Okay, I'll just present Yaniv, my colleague from the Institute for Advanced Studies this year at the Group for Purity and Pollution, Dr. Yaniv Fox from Bar-Ilan University. And first of all, thank you, Yaniv, for coming to our seminar. Yaniv is an old fellow of the center of the CSOC. So I guess you see many familiar faces, right? Except for our current fellows, which we will introduce perhaps after the seminar. So it's especially nice for me to join this or it was an attempt to join two groups which I'm associated with this year, the CSOC, the Center for the Study of Religious Conversion and Interreligious Encounters, and my group at the Institute for Advanced Studies, which Yaniv has formed, a group dealing with purity and pollution in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Finally, due to the COVID scare, we have only one of our fellows, one additional fellow from the group. It's Dr. Eric Fournier, who is joining us today, and also we will have an opportunity to speak a little bit to each other after the seminar. So I'll only add, following what Tafat's introduction, that Dr. Yaniv Fox is a scholar of the early Middle Ages. He has written on the Merovingians and the historiography of the Merovingians, and we're very happy that he's back here to talk about center and periphery through the lens of clergy between town and country in late Merovingian hagiography. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Daniela, and to the center as a whole for inviting me to speak today. As Daniela said, I was a postdoc here for 2 or 3 years. I'm not entirely sure. But it was a really productive time, and so it's really great to be back here and kind of get to see some familiar faces and meet some new faces, which are proof that the center continues its invaluable work. Daniela also said let's try this. A few words about our Institute for Advanced Studies research group. Some of the members couldn't be here today in person, but they are joining us by Zoom. So hopefully they will be present in spirit, if not in person, and able to offer their comments. Okay. This presentation, what would I like to do? I'd like to examine the hagiographical portrayal of ecclesiastical activity in the late Merovingian countryside, especially as it pertains to parochial priests and deacons. Now, when I say late Merovingian, what I mean is the second half of the 7th century in the regions of what is today France, Belgium, the Netherlands. Yeah, that's pretty much it. What I want to do is I want to consider 2 roughly contemporaneous late 7th century saints' lives or hagiographies. And these 2 are the yes, the life of Eligius of Noyon, Vita Eligi Episcopi Noviomagensis, and the suffering of Projectus of Clermont, Passio Projecti Episcopi et Martyris Auvergne. So, as I want to show, these two works, they have some similarities, but they have some important differences. And the two actually approach the relationship between bishops and their rural priests, and between the town and its suffragan parishes in very different ways. And this has to do not only with the saints themselves and their different career trajectories, but also with the different nature of the compositions themselves and the circumstances under which they were composed. Okay, so both saints, Eligius and Projectus, are similar, and they're similar in one important way. They were both of humble origins, humble familial origins, meaning that they didn't come from the very top of the social hierarchy. And this is unusual because most bishops in Merovingian Gaul, in fact, did come from the very, very top. They are what we would call, these two guys, mediocres, okay? Not the wretchedly poor, but not of the senatorial aristocracy either. So recently they've been called the members of the Merovingian middle. Okay, I'm not using middle class, but they are somewhere in between, which means that they weren't obvious candidates for the episcopacy. And we see that their hagiographies, the compositions that were composed in their honor, are somewhat apologetic about this. This is important not only because of its curiosity value, but because at least for Projectus, the hagiography spends a lot of time on events that happened before Projectus was made bishop, so naturally events that took place in the countryside and not in the city. Because for most of his career, Projectus was a deacon in a village church. And the things that preoccupied his time and that are then chronicled in the life are very local in their scale. So things that happen on a very local scale. Had Projectus been made bishop earlier on in his career, this entire facet of his life and his activity would have been obscured from our view. And so we're lucky that we have this, because it is fairly rare to learn about what happens to a bishop before he became bishop. Okay, so by looking at improbable candidates that actually made it, we get a glimpse into often neglected areas of early medieval life. And we can also get a sense of the kind of prospects of upward mobility that these people might have, okay? So, hagiography. Now, first of all, why is it interesting or justified to examine hagiography, to study these questions of periphery center and of movement between these two spaces and upward mobility more generally? Well, first of all, hagiography is the most common type of document to come out of Merovingian Gaul. Okay, we obviously have a lot of different kinds of sources that survive. We have letters, and sermons, and historiography, and liturgy, law, contracts, poetry, you name it. But hagiography is the most common. Okay, now in the past, historians have criticized hagiography for being repetitive, for being formulaic, for being hyperbolic, and because it deals with miracles, so the supernatural, with being unreliable. But mostly it was deemed too thin in historical details to be of any use to political or economic or legal historians. Now, fortunately, recent work has done a lot of work to undo this damage and to show how useful this genre can actually be beyond its function as a mine for facts. Okay, it can be a source for understanding the mentalities of the societies that composed and that consumed hagiography. And we see these compositions used in a variety of contexts. One is liturgical. So we could imagine that hagiographies are employed as part of a homily. So when the bishop is giving a sermon, he can work in the hagiography. During a saint's festival would be a good time. We see it employed in a monastic context, such as when hagiographies are employed as exempla of proper, desirable behavior. Also, more generally, as textual markers for public acts of devotion. And here comes to mind maybe the translatio, the translation of the saint. So that means moving the body of the saint from one location to another, often a more elaborate.
Even the small part.
Yep. Or the inventio, which is the first act of finding the body or the relics of a saint, usually revealed through a dream to an industrious bishop who then, marshals the community to go on an Easter egg hunt, at the end of which they find. Okay, so contemporaries also returned to their hagiographies, to re-edit them, to rework them, to change them, to conform to evolving social agendas. We see a very intense process of réécriture, of rewriting, particularly in the Carolingian era. Okay, so works that were composed in the 7th century were then expanded and re-edited to meet the needs and the sensibilities of the Carolingian readership. And mind you, this was a readership that was more sensitive to issues of church hierarchy, behavior of clerics and bishops, and discipline, and so on. And actually, the Vita Eligi, one of the compositions that I want to talk about today, has undergone exactly such a process. It was composed, at least the first layer was composed in the Merovingian era, shortly after Eligius died, but then was reworked at least twice that we can tell, even though it is very hard to discern which parts are Merovingian and which parts are Carolingian or even later Carolingian. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this guy, Eligius of Noyon. Okay, so Eligius was the bishop of the northern city of Noyon and some adjacent territories from 641 AD, all the years here AD, to his death in 660. So roughly 20 years of episcopacy. After he died, he became a popular saint, and even a character in a well-known French children's song, Le Bon Roi d'Agobert, which some of you may know. Okay, actually, there were 2 cinematic adaptations, one in the 60s and one in the 70s. You can look these up on YouTube. They're a fun time. So Eligius was appointed bishop after having served as a high-ranking secular official at the court of the Frankish king Clovis II. Okay, this is not Clovis I, the one who got baptized into Christianity. This is his great-great-grandson, who reigned from 639 until 657. And Eligius served primarily as a royal goldsmith. So the person in charge of making the crown jewels, of minting coins, of doing anything that necessitated working with precious metals. And you might ask yourself, what is a bishop doing? What is a goldsmith doing as a bishop, right? Well, actually, such nominations were fairly common in the Merovingian kingdoms. That secular officials of every sort were then nominated to ecclesiastical roles. Now, as I said earlier, Eligius did not come from a particularly rich or powerful family. We know his parents' names, Eucharius and Turigia, and the hagiography says that they were more renowned for their Christian piety than they were for their ancestry. And this is a way for the hagiographer to apologize for the protagonist not coming from the appropriate social background, okay? They actually came from a villa on the outskirts of the city of Limoges. So this is far to the south and very much removed from the Frankish court in Paris and all of its various intrigues, okay? So as a boy, Eligius was sent to the nearby city of Limoges to train with a man called Abo, who was a goldsmith and minter. So the man who was in charge of minting coins on the local level for the king. He did very well, and he was an impressive young pupil. So he continued his apprenticeship under the royal treasurer, and soon he was noticed by the king and offered a position in his service. So in 632, this is prior to Clovis II, this is under his father, Dagobert I, he received a gift, a very generous royal endowment. Now, this was land, okay? He got a lot of land. And the land was actually near his hometown. So what he did was he established a monastery named Solignac, not far from his hometown. Okay, and we have the establishment charter of this monastery. And it's not a very long document. I only have the last page here, but you can see the signature list of all the people who signed this charter. You can see there are no fewer than 7 bishops and a dozen other notables, meaning counts and dukes and so on. So this is clear evidence that Eligius moved, at least at the time of the establishment of the monastery, in the highest social circles, okay? And through his choice of abbot for this monastery, a man named Ramaclus, we can see that Eligius was building ties with Clovis's brother, so the other Frankish king. There were 2 Frankish kingdoms at the time. One is Neustria, the other is Austrasia. So Clovis was in Taris, meaning in Neustria, and his brother Sigebert III was in Austrasia, probably in the city of Metz. And so Eligius was nurturing ties with that side of the family as well, and also with a leading family in Austrasia, a family called the Pippinids. And we know the Pippinids because in a few generations, they will become, who? Do you know? The Carolingians, right? The people who would displace the Merovingians eventually in 751. So the establishment charter, as you can see, tells us a lot about Eligius. Okay, but most of what we know about this guy comes from his hagiography. Essentially, everything that is biographical we know from the hagiography. And this hagiography was written, at least its first layer, was written by his close friend, another bishop, a man named Audouin of Rouen. Okay, Audouin became bishop of Rouen concurrently with Eligius becoming bishop of Lyon. Now, one story from the Vitae Ligi is especially interesting to us because it talks about a condition that Eligius and Audouin made to the king before agreeing to become bishop. Now, this is strange, right? Because mostly when people say here that they become bishops, they're happy. Not Eligius. Eligius said, wait a second. I have a condition. And the condition is that in order for Audouin and Eligius to refrain from what they call simoniaca haeresis, or the heresy of simony, canon law requires that they serve as priests for at least 1 year before becoming bishop. Okay? So we should, keep this in mind. Obviously, also, I mean, on the narrative, dramatic level, Eligius's refusal was good material for the hagiographer because it was proof that he was worthy of the high office of bishop because he wasn't some power-grabbing, right, bad guy. But in one way in particular, this stipulation is especially informative because it represents a tendency of the hagiography to look at priests that are not bishops, meaning presbyters and deacons and the non-episcopal clergy, as a transitional phase in the life of the hagiographical era. Okay, what does this mean? It means that hagiographies almost assume that their protagonists will end up in the role of bishop. Okay, and they spend very little time on the other stages of their protagonist's career. Now, the main reason for this, we know, is because Merovingian saints' lives heavily overrepresent the social elite. Okay, like I said, the episcopacy was a natural terminus for the careers of so many Merovingians, aristocrats turned saints. So the attention given to this ultimate part of their career seems warranted, but it leaves the lower rungs of ecclesiastical hierarchy mostly in the dark, even if these guys were ubiquitous in the saint's life. When they do appear, they're usually cast either as villains, so people, giving opposition to the saint, or as very obedient tools of the saint. But regardless of which way they appear, they're very flat in terms of their depictions. Okay, we never get to see them as protagonists, as full rounded figures. And this is already true for the earliest Gallic sources when we look at Sulpicius Severus's dialogues, which talks about Martin of Tours. We see Martin colliding with an insubordinate priest called Brictius. Okay, but this is a very common theme, and we see this in Gregory of Tours and in a range of other hagiographies. Okay, and another result of this hagiographical tendency to focus on bishops is that the affairs of the city usually take precedence to affairs in the countryside. Okay, now the link between the bishop and the city is, it's an obvious feature of Christian society. So it's only natural that the city comes to the fore. Okay, but again, that has the unwanted consequence of leaving the more rural aspect of clerical activity obscured from view. Okay, so fortunately, of the saints' lives produced in 7th century Gaul, the Passio Projecti is a clear exception to this rule. It contains what is a fairly rare detailed exposition of the protagonist's career before he became Bishop of Clermont, and it was probably composed by someone who not only knew Projectus, but also many of the persons that contributed to his rise and to his fall. So this makes the hagiography uniquely helpful for our inquiry. Okay, so like I said, Eligius and Projectus shared several traits. One is their mediocre familial background, which both of them overcame through hard work and through religious fervor. Both were products of the educational system emanating from the monastery of Luxeuil and its daughter houses. I can say a little more about Luxeuil, but maybe it's better to keep this for the questions and answers. We learn about Projectus's years as a priest because, like Eligius, he eventually rose to the episcopacy and had a hagiography written about him. And there are some other quirks, like Projectus's mother was named Eligia, which is the female variant of Eligius. And like Eligius's mother Turigia, she had a vision when she was pregnant that foretold of her son's future accomplishments. Now, Projectus also had a relative named Eligius, although the two are not related, who was martyred during an attack on the bishop's family. And finally, both had what seemingly strong convictions about simony. There were also important differences. Eligius was a layperson, right? And a southerner appointed to a northern see by the king. Projectus, on the other hand, was a cleric who became bishop in his own hometown after several unsuccessful runs, one of which pitted him against the royal nominee, which means that he was not the royal nominee. Eligius's life shows that his interests spanned the length and breadth of Clovis's kingdom. So he was a very well-connected bishop with a portfolio of interests. So he was, Yadobakor, so to speak. Projectus's activities remained confined to his own city. Like I said, Projectus was not the top choice for bishop. His appointment came about after a long process of campaigning and networking on the local level, on which I will expand shortly. And finally, the two men differed in the kinds of hagiographies they received. Eligius's hagiography was first written by Audouin of Rouen, who was really one of the most important churchmen in 7th century Francia and a saint in his own right, possibly even more important and saintly than Eligius himself. And since Eligius had a bishop write his hagiography, then it's written from the bishop's perspective, right? So the hagiography is divided into two books, and the two books are thematically divided by Eligius's rise to the episcopacy. So when Eligius becomes bishop, this opens the second and much longer book. And this was considered a defining moment in Eligius's life by Audouin. Okay, when we look at the second book, it's full of appearances of kings and queens and bishops and abbots and senior lay officials. It's a who's who, it's a whole list of stars. Projectus's Passio, on the other hand, is much more evenly divided, reflecting the fact that for most of his career, he was a deacon and not a bishop. And his hagiographer is anonymous, so probably a local or a relative, we don't really know. Okay, so having said all of this, let's look at some countryside intrigues, some examples of the junior clergy in these lives and their relationship with the city and with the country. So one theme that the Vita Eligi often explores is episcopal authority over clerics and the discipline of clerics. It's probably true that the busier the bishop, the more self-reliant and independently minded his clergy, okay, especially in the more remote regions of the diocese. And this especially would be the case with larger ecclesiastical provinces, or when the bishop in question was perceived as an outsider, or when the bishop in question was frequently called to appear in the royal court. In such instances, we can imagine, episcopal intervention might be seen as an infringement on the cleric's traditional autonomy and then aggressively resisted. And all of these conditions, you've probably figured out already, apply fully to Eligius. Okay, so here is a little snippet from the Vita Eligi, from the 21st chapter of the second book. And it tells the following story. Another time when he, meaning Eligius, was visiting his diocese following episcopal custom, he interdicted the course of the oblation being celebrated in a basilica for a particular reason. So he stumbled upon some ceremony. For there was a priest there suffering in bad conscience, whom he excommunicated because of his guilt. He took the bishop's words lightly, not thinking that he had to obey the order. When he thought Eligius had gone far enough away from the place, he began to ring the bell at the usual hour, as was his custom. So he's playing hide and seek with his bishop. Then, confuting the human presumption, the creature, more insensible than rational, heeded the bishop's words, imposing silence on it, and not a sound emerged from his strenuous ringing of the bell. This is a kind of an awkward phrasing, but what it means is that Eligius did some hocus pocus, and all of a sudden the bells stopped working. So the priest tried to ring the bells, but to no avail. For a long time, the priest pulled at the rope until he realized that the bells would remain mute. Then he went out of the basilica, the cause being made clear at the same time. Then, mindful of Eligius's excommunication, he hurried after him, praying that he would reconcile the basilica. But although he was kind, this is Eligius now, he did not want to act hastily, but first to have satisfaction that his sentence reflected. So he let the priest cook on a small fire for a few days. And a third day and night went by, still with no sound. But then nuncios came with letters from the optimates and signores, so from the elderly, notable people of the parish. And at last their prayers overcame, and the prelate was satisfied with the penitence, and the place was reconciled with a single word from Eligius. And soon, when the signal was touched, the bells were restored to their tintinnabulation. Okay? So this is a nice little story. You see that the charge against the priest here was of mala conscientia, bad conscience. So it's probably an intentionally vague accusation, which kind of leaves us guessing as to what the original reasons were for the excommunication. But if the priest's subsequent actions are anything to go by, it was probably rooted in his reluctance to accept Eligius's authority. As we can see, Eligius ended up reinstating the bishop, right? Signifying that perhaps the bishop wasn't as confident as we think to depose his underlings permanently, even ones who openly challenged him. And in fact, refusal to accept Eligius's authority is a recurring theme in the life. Now, in a diocese as large as the one with which Eligius was entrusted, it would have been difficult to constantly control and monitor far-off clerics. But more to the point, the clergy operated on a number of social levels. So not all of them were connected to the town and to the bishops. Local considerations were just as important. Okay, so you have to realize that priests were expected to tend to the spiritual needs of their flock. So it is possible to imagine that the community in that parish pressured the priest to perform his duties regardless of the bishop's wishes, as evidenced by the letters from the optimates and the signores asking Eligius to reinstate the priest. So in sum, the leniency with which this rebellious priest was handled suggests that even bishops were forced to balance the demand to assert their authority with forces operating on the ground. Okay, now this kind of dynamic was also of interest to the author of the Passio Projecti, although the perspective of its composition, as we shall see shortly, is very different. Okay, so let's first take a look at Projectus's childhood. The social circles in which Projectus moved as a child are expanded upon in the early chapters of the Passio. Okay, Projectus had an uncle who was an archpresbyter or an archpriest named Palladius. So Palladius was invited to dinner at the deacon's house, and he decided to take along Projectus, his nephew, who was by now being educated in the parish church and showing great promise in his schoolyard. The deacon, a man named Babbo, was a very unpleasant guy who kept a pack of dogs, menacing dogs, chained up in his front yard. Okay. Oh, so the dogs would often growl and even bite the guests, and Babbo would get an enormous kick out of this. He would laugh and smile, but on this occasion, the dogs were very quickly soothed by the young, precocious Projectus, right? But regardless of this little miracle, this entire episode is an exploration of hospitality done wrong. We might nevertheless infer that more welcoming dinners were an integral part of parochial socialization, right? So when we look at the practice of sponsorship and tutelage by older relatives, especially from the mother's side, this was as prevalent here as it was a century earlier in the days of Gregory of Tours, who was likewise mentored by his great uncle, Nicetius of Lyon. Now, of course, Gregory of Tours' relatives were members of the senatorial elite, so his access to institutional power as a kid growing up would have been much more impressive than Projectus's. But the type of conditioning and acculturation for boys being prepped for ecclesiastical office was remarkably similar. The next stage of Projectus's career came when his parents gave him to the household of the archdeacon, Genesius. Genesius was an episcopal hopeful, and soon he was, in fact, promoted to the rank of bishop. And it is in this environment that Projectus studied and worked for the next few years. Now, Genesius was impressed by Projectus and gave him the job of dispensing alms on the bishop's behalf. So he was given control over money. Okay, and this is a sensitive responsibility, and especially as far as his colleagues in the episcopal household were concerned. Actually, the Hagiography says that he did his job so well that he became a threat to the other clergymen. So, as often happens, they decided to set a trap for him. And what did they do? Well, Martin, the man who was in charge of the arranging the musical performances of the liturgy as part of the episcopal household, assigned the young Projectus a liturgical role for which he was entirely unprepared. Okay, so he was a young boy at the time, or at least a young man. And Projectus realized this and began to panic, but then he soon got a grip and started praying to St Julian of Brioude. St Julian is a local saint, a very rustic saint, actually. And we learn a lot about St Julian from Gregory of Tours, who wrote an account of St Julian's miracles. But anyway, the praying worked. Okay, and Projectus performed with masterful precision. And actually, the Vita tells us that he was preferred thereafter to the other singers in the diocese. Now, of course, this is hagiographical exaggeration, I know, but even if we question the historicity of this episode, some of its components are nevertheless instructive. First is that the clergy clearly competed for the attention of the bishop, and for a place within the church and within the episcopal household. And of course, for the recognition of the lay community. So imagine that liturgy was a way of interacting with the community. It was an important tool for making yourself known to the congregation. Also, we can say that the existence of a role of a liturgical director, who is probably also in charge of the clergy's musical training, is interesting, although not much more can be said about this. But after this little incident, Priactus was offered a promotion. He was to oversee the important church of Isual to the south of the city. Now, this was a church where he attended school as a boy, which probably means that Isual was Priactus's home territory. And this is quite the promotion for someone who had held no prior position. And it is likely that he was made deacon at that time in honor of this promotion. Okay. So from Isual, Priactus began to carve out for himself a particular niche in the diocese. The village itself is separated from the city of Clermont by some 30 mountainous kilometers. Okay, so it would have been quite a schlep to come from Clermont to Isual, which means that the bishop remained relatively distant, and the Priactus was in charge of overseeing the daily needs of the community. Okay, so let's look at some of the connections that Priactus was busy building as deacon of Isual. So the first group of activities can be termed, I guess, distribution of resources. Okay, so we see that under his care, Isual's estate and coffers grew profitable, which allowed him to ramp up public spending, especially the distribution of alms. So when the church was successful, that meant that he could give out more money to his congregants. So the money, where did the money come from, right? The money likely came from the coffers of Isual, but the Vita tells us that they were kept at the home of a relative of Priactus. Okay, so the finances of the church and the family were not very clearly differentiated. Okay, so this was not a Ba'am, Chevra Ba'am. This was not a limited company. We might also hazard to guess that this was a form of campaigning. Okay, distributing alms, especially in any future bid for higher office, which we know was forthcoming. Another category of activities we might call hospitality. Okay, the Passio mentions two separate instances where Priactus hosted a group of locals for dinner. One such occasion, he was informed by his servants that the pantry was empty. You know, that's quite embarrassing to invite people home and then to discover that your fridge is empty. So he miraculously conjured up a fish. Okay, okay, that's not a lot, but the second story is a little more informative. Okay, so what happens in the second dinner? Priactus sets out to the city of Clermont to meet the bishop, because the bishop invited all of the heads of the parishes to gather at his home for Easter. Okay, they have their little get together, and after the visit, Priactus hosts a party in his townhouse in Clermont. So by this point, Priactus has a nice little condo situation in Clermont, where he nurtures alternative networks. Okay, and in this case, with the bishop, with other priests, and with the townsfolk. Okay, so these would have been different people from the previous dinner. Okay, now, at the meal are present a lot of guests, but also 3 guests who are penitents, which means that they are there to show their respects, but they don't go crazy with the food and certainly not with the alcohol. Okay, and so it turns out that some of the guests are making fun of these penitents for not drinking, from abstaining from drinking and from eating, like, come on, you only live once, you know, let's party and so on. And they refuse. And so Priactus becomes aware of this and he begins to berate his guests for making fun of these 3 penitents. Okay, and then what happens? Naturally, the house collapses, as happens in these occasions, with only Priactus and his 3 penitent friends remaining unharmed. Okay, and this, according to the hagiographer, proves, of course, that he was right in his criticism. Of course, this was Priactus's house, so it doesn't really shine positively on him that his house collapsed as he was hosting dinner, but you know, you might say that maybe some recollection of this event remained, and that it was somehow incorporated into the Passio. Okay, we do know the names of the penitents, though. This could be taken to mean that they had living relatives when the Vita was composed, or that they were of the town's elites, so people worth knowing. One, we are told, was a monk, and the other were men of local repute. So people worth knowing and people that probably had money and they were kind of interested in donating to the parish and so on. So this is another level of the network. Another category in which he was busy was literary projects. Okay, he was actually initiating the composition of a few literary projects. One is a libellus, it's like a pamphlet, a small book, chronicling the deeds of 4 martyrs of Clermont, and also a hagiography of another martyr called Austremonius, Saint Austremonius. Why is this interesting? I mean, literary projects are initiated all the time in the Merovingian world. And indeed, these seem like relatively logical projects to pursue on a diocesan level, meaning if the bishop did this, we wouldn't even think twice. But it's instructive to find them on the parochial one. Okay, so for a priest and not a bishop to decide to compose a hagiography. Now, we don't know if this was a first step in trying to appropriate what was already an established cult, but we can say that the 4 martyrs were either laypersons themselves or junior members of the clergy. Okay, they were certainly not bishops of Clermont because we have a precise list of those in the 10th book of Gregory of Tours' Histories. So the choice to promote non-episcopal saints could have been intentional. How do I mean? Well, if Priactus chose a bishop to write a hagiography about, this could have been received badly, okay, and regarded as the prerogative of the episcopal see. An attempt to try an unsolicited rendition would broadcast to everyone in the diocese that Priactus sees himself as a natural candidate for bishop, okay? And he wasn't ready to make that move yet. But we can see that during his time as bishop, when he was eventually made bishop, he attempted to have these martyrs translated to the monastery that he had begun building. Okay? So how did it happen that Priactus eventually became bishop? Well, it's a kind of like an unexpected little tale. The bishop died, and then another bishop was appointed, a man named Felix. And when Felix moved up, the entire clerical ranks moved up. So Priactus got another promotion. And this time he got control over a local monastery, the Abbey of Chantoin. In this capacity, we hear that he is referred to as one of the señores abates, okay, one of the senior clergymen in the diocese. And I say clergymen and not abbots because this is the sense in which it's understood in this case. It does seem that he didn't relinquish any of his clerical duties. So he kept being the deacon of Issouel, but he was also in charge of this monastery of Chantoin. Now, Felix died soon thereafter, and then Priactus kind of started thinking, what are my chances of becoming bishop? And he started asking around, key people, and they told him, well, I mean, it's not out of the question, but you will need a lot of money to secure this nomination, to pay the right people, to grease the right cogs in the machine. So as one of the 5 leading clergymen in the diocese, Priactus was a contender for episcopal office, but not a leading one. The job eventually didn't go to Priactus, but to another person, an archdeacon named Garibald. And the way that Garibald was made bishop is kind of interesting. So it turns out that Garibald preemptively signed a contract with the rest of the nominees for them to, all other 4, to support his candidacy. Okay, so before it was known who was made bishop, Garibald went around and had all the other 4 señores abates sign that when the bishop dies, they will support his candidacy. And so they did, they signed the document, but still, when Felix died, Priactus objected and challenged the nomination. So Garibald then proceeded to uncover the document and show everybody, look, Priactus signed this document. So there's really nothing to do. It's open and shut. But then the other people on the contract, the other signatories, had a change of heart. And they decided to back Priactus's candidacy. So then Garibaldi did what was natural, and he paid off certain key people in the diocese. He bribed them, essentially, to pressure the priests to change their minds and to back off. And so what happens here is that the pressure exerted by the lay community on individual priests swayed the race in Garibaldi's favor. So he was made bishop. But you know how it is. He died 40 days later, and the episcopal seat was again vacant. This time around, Priactus again nominated himself, but this time he went against the local count. Okay, so this count in the Merovingian world is a man in charge of the judicial system, also taxation, policing. So this was a very important man. And this count was backed by the king. The king at this time was Childeric II. So this was the second of Clovis II's two sons. So again, Priactus finds himself outclassed in this competition, but he won nonetheless because the count withdrew his candidacy. Why? Because he was afraid of contradicting canonical restrictions on lay ordination, which means that he wasn't a priest for the necessary year. Okay, just like Eligius. So strangely, the Passio has nothing to say about the intervention of other bishops, nor of the king's reaction when finding out that his candidate renounced his candidacy. The count and the king, even though they ostensibly opposed Priactus, received good press in the composition. And it's probably since both continued to exert some influence on the career of Priactus after the election. Now, let's compare the Vita Eligi and the Passio Projecti, right? In the Vita Eligi, the canonical requirement to serve a year as a priest served two goals. One is to demonstrate Eligius's insistence on proper church protocol, and the other was to incorporate the hagiographical topos of refusing ordination. In the Passio Projecti, on the other hand, it did exactly the opposite, because it allowed Priactus to snatch the nomination which the royal candidate had forfeited. Okay, so Priactus was made Bishop of Clermont, if only for a short time. The bishops of Clermont were not known to stay around for too long.
Sorry, Yaniv, I hope I have you asked you. All the story, all the details you told us are from those two compositions alone?
Yes, it all comes from the Hagiographies. So the fact that he was made bishop didn't erase Priactus's mediocre origins, nor did it significantly expand his support base. Okay, so very soon he got into trouble. So Priactus got into trouble with a man named Hector. Hector was the Patricius of Marseille, so sort of like a municipal governor or a mayor if a mayor had an army. Okay, the two of them held competing claims over an estate. There was an old lady who died and left the estate to the bishop, but Hector was now contesting this bequest. The conflict escalated, and Priactus was summoned to the king, but he won. He won the judgment of the king. The fact that he won was not so much an indication of his own power, but the fact that Hector was compromised by his involvement in another conflict, okay, that is unrelated to this case, but Priactus was able to capitalize on this. So Hector decided it was best for him to get up and run. So he left in the middle of the night, but he was hunted down and killed. So Priactus was happy, returned to Clermont, but shortly thereafter, the king and queen were also killed in what is like a coup d'etat. And then Priactus remained exposed because his royal patrons were now out of the picture. Okay, so Hector's relatives got together and avenged Hector and killed Priactus. Okay, so Priactus was dead. He became a popular saint very shortly thereafter, a martyr, no less. And it is ironic because the cult thrived as a result of the reconciliation between the bishop's enemies and Priactus's relatives. Now, the bishop's enemies, mind you, are the people, well, one of them at least, is the person who replaced Priactus as bishop, a man named Avitus. Okay, so the people who killed Priactus were able to leverage their little victory to become bishops of Clermont. Okay, so what happened to his relatives after the murder? We know of one, a person named Gundolenus, who was an ostiarius domus, so like a doorman, also probably a relative, who was killed alongside Priactus. Another relative named Eligius, who I mentioned previously, was also killed. And a third named Godo, when he understood that his family is being liquidated, he got up and ran, and he went to a distant monastery. But he was invited back after the dust had settled by Avitus, the replacement bishop, who was involved in killing his relative. And he said, look, I want to make amends, and maybe you can become an abbot of a monastery in the diocese. So he took him up on his offer, and the offer was good. He was actually made an abbot. So to summarize, we have one almoner, one doorman, and one refugee turned local abbot. Okay, these are relatives of Priactus, of whom we know. The fourth is a woman named Gundilla or Gundilana, who was already an abbess in the diocese when Priactus was bishop. She is possibly the woman who commissioned the Passio Projecti. We're not sure, but we think. And we see that the Passio is very cautious in its handling of Avitus, the replacement bishop. And this is evidence of his enduring influence over the narrative. Okay, so when all is said and done, we see that the remaining relatives, Godo and Gundilla, occupy relatively central ecclesiastical positions in the Diocese of Clermont. And they were allowed to hold on to them by their former relatives. By their former adversaries. Okay, and we see that a monastery is established, several donations are made to that community, and the composition of a hagiography all point to a desire between the two parties to kind of make amends. Okay, and so we see that Priactus's family leveraged his episcopacy and then his martyrdom to become upwardly mobile. Whether their good fortunes endured, we cannot say, although it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that the episcopacy remained forever out of reach. Okay, so some short conclusions. The Vitae Ligi and the Passio Projecti contain very different images of the clergy. These differences are mostly linked to the careers led by their respective protagonists. Eligius was made bishop as soon as was canonically possible. Priactus's time as bishop was a brief conclusion to a long career of ecclesiastical service spent primarily in the countryside. The Vitae Ligi was written by a bishop, and as a result, priests and other lower clergy appear from the bishop's perspective, either as exempla of piety or as cautionary tales. Passio Projecti, on the other hand, places much more emphasis on the early and intermediate stages of the protagonist's ecclesiastical career. The first third of the Passio of Priactus was written from the perspective of the parish, and rather than that of the diocese. And much like Eligius's insubordinate priest, Priactus was relatively autonomous as deacon. He makes decisions, we see, about finances, about saints' cults, about liturgy, and so on. From the Passio, we can say that the contenders for the bishop's throne, for the episcopal office, were overwhelmingly local. Other compositions give the impression that the parochial priests were marginalized by the overwhelming force of the royal court and of the great men of the realm. And the Passio Projecti illuminates another facet of ecclesiastical politics, which is small-scale networking. Okay, so maintaining connections, social connections through mentorship, through gift giving, feasting, fundraising. This was ubiquitous for deacons and archdeacons and priests, as it was for bishops, only on a more modest scale. Okay, so Priactus's climb up the ecclesiastical rungs is a demonstration of how social mobility could work for members of families that were not placed at the very top. And likewise, his downfall is indicative of the limitations of upward mobility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. אנחנו רואים את מי שפה, רוצים שאני נפסיק עם המצגת ונראה את השלב של השאלות.
כן, כן, בוודאי.
Stop share. Stop share.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Yaniv will answer to a question, but מתחילים אחרת. We will start with this room. אנחנו עדיין לא רואים את זה אותם. אבל נאסוף
אתם שומעים אותנו?
שומעים אתכם,
כן, אבל איכשהו אנחנו לא רואים, לכן גם בהתחלה.
אולי נסגור.
אז אני אנצל את זה כדי להתנצל שאני הולכת ולהגיד שיניב זאת ההרצאה, זאת מיכל בר-אשר סיגל. זאת הייתה הרצאה מעולה, ניתנה נפלא, למדתי מלא ואת התותח. כל הכבוד.
תודה רבה, מיכל. ביי. אוקיי.
אפשר לעשות מהסטאפ שחשבתי שעשיתי. סליחה.
הנה, זהו, עכשיו אנחנו רואים את כולם, נכון?
אני מתנצלת שאני צריכה לעזוב לפגישה אחרת.
תודה, מיכל.
אז...
Yes.
English.
I think for our guests in English,
So just an interesting observation. Both of these bishops started out with roles of managing money or precious metals.
Right.
Which is a very interesting parallel. Does that have any bearing on context?
I mean, definitely the ability to handle money is key for any senior ecclesiastical role. And we see bishops handling money all the time, negotiating the buying and selling of estates, managing serfs, managing slaves, running errands, financial errands for the kings, and so on. So definitely being a good financier and a good financial manager is important. But Eligius's training was in jewelry and minting, so it wasn't in the handling of money per se. Whereas Priactus's advancement was handling money on a very local scale. And because some of the money was held by his family, you kind of had to think how much of the money was being funneled into his family's.
And I'm thinking of the alms, the role of being the one who gives out the alms beforehand.
Right.
Before he gets the promotion. And the side of handling the jewels and the metal work. Those are both roles that money is entrusted.
Right, right.
And maybe that's some sort of motif for signaling that they're capable.
Possibly it's an attempt to invert another hagiographical motif, which is the gift that is expected to be given to the diocese by the candidate when he is applying. So when you become bishop, you need to convince the diocese that you have enough money, not to buy the candidacy, of course, but to give something like a contribution or an endowment to the church. Okay, so maybe this is an attempt to play on that theme, but you're right, of course, that money is important in that sense. Should I? And Uli.
Thank you. I'm used to reading geographies for earlier and later saints, and in these other geographies, it states that the circumstances in which the death of the saint plays a much bigger role in the reasons for which they're considered saints to begin with. Now, in both cases, unless you can go into this in depth, you can see that the death itself plays a major role. So my question is, in both cases, or in either case, does the authors narrate or perform a kind of polemics in the decision of the community to accept these people as saints? Because obviously it's not a matter of their being persecuted something along those lines. And also, you say, I think, in the case of the first Saint
Eligius.
or maybe both of them, the works were reworked later on. So it seems that people had states in the lives of these people, and it was hard for me to understand what the stakes are for later generations, because it seemed that it's interesting for you, for us, because it sheds a light on something that has, doesn't seem to be involved in major questions or sort of networks, but for them, for some reason, it was of importance, and it's hard for me to see why.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. It's a long question. Let me try and see if I can clarify. First of all, Eligius wasn't martyred. He lived out his days. He died of old age, and so he's a confessor, not a martyr. The fact that we even regard Praectus as a martyr is a matter of some local expediency, right? The fact that his murderers are really the ones who commissioned the hagiography is indication not of his actual martyrdom, because this was a political assassination if it was anything. But the fact that in order to achieve a sort of rapprochement and to quiet the litigants in the community, it was considered advantageous for everyone to toe this line, to get behind this idea that Praectus was a martyr. And we see that the hagiographer points a finger of blame, but not towards the bishop, but towards some unassociated Saxons who were conveniently foreign, and so you can pin the blame on them. Now, in order for us to understand why Carolingians wanted to return to hagiographies and to rework them and to re-edit them, we need to keep several things in mind. First of all is that when saints became popular saints and their cults were integrated into the sanctoral cycle and they were part of the liturgy, this would necessitate the reading of sections of their hagiography during their Dies Natalis, during their festivals and so on. And so just like today, I mean, there are certain contents that we read from the previous century that people are uncomfortable with because of the contents are no longer suited to our society. This is the same thing. The Frankish realm underwent a very profound process of ecclesiastical reform in the late 8th and early 9th century, a lot of which had to do with clerical behavior, clerical celibacy, subordination of priests to bishops, jurisdiction, and a range of other issues. So when we read hagiographies from the Merovingian era that reflect a very different reality than the one Carolingian readers were used to, then they needed these things fixed. This is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that the saint has come to symbolize not only the historical person, but also the institution and the cult connected to that institution. So Eligius's cult became lucrative, okay, in the financial sense. And so in order for the financial viability of these saints' cults to continue, certain emendations were necessary to the hagiographies that reflected contemporary power relations, such as what are the power relationships between the monastery and the bishopric, right? So we see 8th century, 9th century authors, especially working from within a monastic context, attempt to reconstitute and redefine the relationship between the monastery and the diocese to reflect the fact that the monastery is independent of episcopal oversight. And this relates to some ongoing conflict about land management and so on. So there's a symbolic facet to it, but also a very concrete one. I hope that answers your question.
And I see that in Jackie also.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much for fascinating talk. And my question is about center and periphery. You mentioned at the beginning that almost all hagiographies from the Merovingian age tend to focus on the city and not on the countryside.
Yes.
And I wonder what does it tell us about cities in Merovingian Europe, because perhaps it's a naive impression, probably is, but sometimes we tend to think that cities came to power and became much more significant in later ages. And during the medieval period, the countryside was actually very significant. Elites used to also stay at the countryside, but it sounds like it's much more complicated. So can you elaborate a little bit about the place of the cities?
Okay, so there's a very old model by a historian called Edith Emin, talks about the fate of cities in the post-Roman world, and she roughly divides it into three types of cities: cities that were that existed in the Roman world and continued, and then cities that were drastically altered or even removed altogether, and then cities that had no roots in the Roman world, but grew up as organic marketplaces or organic junctures of commerce and trade and so on. This is true in a sense, okay? So when we look at Marseille, for instance, okay, Gregory of Tours talks a lot about Marseille and about the networks of trade within which Marseille was embedded, right? The Jews of Marseille, for instance, who had a lot of contacts with the Jewish communities elsewhere around the Mediterranean, and so Marseille was able to become something like the gateway into Gaul. And Henri Pirenne did a lot of work about this, on this. But when we see, let's say, the divisionis regni, so the divisions of the realm when one king is preparing to die and to distribute his bequest to his sons, we see that the realm is not passed on in a system of primogeniture. So it's not like the oldest son becomes the heir. What happens is that the realm is divided, and it's usually divided along municipal or diocesan lines, right? So the king would say, okay, these are the cities that I control. Let's say 30 civitates, for instance. So this means the city and the jurisdiction. So this son gets this, and this city. This son gets another 5 cities, and this is how he divides the kingdom. And actually, we see in these divisions that there is no territorial integrity. So one son can get 3 cities in the northwest and then 2 cities in the southeast, and there's no right, there's no connection between the territories controlled by each son. So I think that already tells you that cities were essential units of territorial management. Now, of course, within the city, we see certain institutions. So the city controls taxation. The city controls the judicial activity. The city is the place where trade is centered. The city is, I mean, obviously, and I think that comes out of my presentation, is that the city was the seat of the bishop. That's the most important parameter that makes a city a city. And it's like there's an important popular passage from Gregory of Tours where he says, look at Dijon. Dijon is a beautiful place. It has a wall, it has towers, it has lush fields, it has trade activity. I don't for the life of me understand why it's not a city. And what does he mean when he says it's not a city? He means why there's no bishop, right? Because the bishop gives his stamp of approval, making this habitation a city. And this is not like in the Roman era where the emperor would say, okay, I grant this town the status of a city, and so on. So the cities were very important, even though there are, I guess you could say that there are spheres of activity that are more inclined to be urban, and then there are spheres of activity that are more rural. So the king usually held court in a rural villa, not in the city. Okay, but the bishops would meet in a city. So there are certain fields of activity where you see are associated more with the urban aspects of activity, and then there are obviously others. Okay, but obviously I know it's a very long and complicated process, so I can't really do it justice here.
So in the audience of this Hagiography, can you say they are urban or monastic, which is, I don't know, who is it intended?
Well, that depends on which stage of the use of the hagiography we're looking at. I mean, on the very immediate level, I think we should read the hagiography as a manifesto of peace between the people fighting around in the diocese. But as we move in time and old feuds are forgotten and the cult of the saint becomes the central facet of this activity, then I think the people of the Diocese of Clermont and later other people whose dioceses have relics of Praectus become the intended audience. Okay, so yeah, it is possible that the monastic populations of the Diocese of Clermont read this during their evening reading, but I would hazard to guess that most people were exposed to this hagiography because they heard it given in a sermon in church. You want to ask people from Zoom? Okay.
And also, okay.
Well, I was pointing to them earlier, but I can ask a question while if I'm speaking. I was wondering, you alluded to just now how complicated the geography is, geopolitics, right?
Right.
So do we have any way, or has anyone ever done, like trying to track the support on the tension between local and royal, but with the geopolitics, right? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, there's a project by a French university, I can't remember which, but the project itself is called Ministrel, and it's like an interactive map of jurisdictions and dioceses, and you can kind of go between key dates, the key divisions of the realm, and see what changed. There's a lot of work yet to be done on this. And of course, the sources can only go so far because some dioceses, we just don't know. I mean, they might be Neustrian, they might be Austrasian, they might be Burgundian. We simply don't know. And of course, as modern people, we kind of get our perspective on borders is such that, okay, this is Israel. I travel by bus and I reach the border, and beyond that border is now Syria or something like that. But this is not what's going on here, right? You should look at it more like, when you're close to a radio station, the signal is strong, but when you move farther away, the signal reduces in strength until you no longer can feel it, right? So this is pretty much the same. You move farther from the royal ability to enforce authority, and the farther away you go, the more in no man's land you are. And we can also see that there are overlapping areas of contested authority and so on. So it's not such a cut and dry process as you now have.
What I was thinking about this, just to clarify, is that, if someone is from a certain region,
right,
and the locals know, oh, he's from the other side, and that could explain some hostility in the sources that sometimes make no sense. That's what I'm thinking about.
Okay.
He speaks another language, he has another accent. Yeah, so you immediately hear it. Yes. The idea is that nobody in the church, in the world of the church, could change the place. The locals would immediately hear it.
There's actually a funny story from the life of Eligius. Okay, Eligius is a southerner, so they call him Roman. Okay, and this Roman sees them having fun at a saint's feast day. Okay, and of course a good bishop is always opposed to fun. So when he sees them dancing, he's like, "Stop this immediately! This is just too much fun." What's the name of that movie with the town? Footloose? Yeah, so I'm thinking of Footloose. Anyway, and so they say, listen, Roman, you will never stop our parties. We will fight for our right to party. And so, of course, he waves his magic wand, and then they're stuck in their dancing poses for a year until they beg him for forgiveness, until eventually he lets them loose and so on, and then they've learned their lesson and they won't have any more fun. But you can really sense the enmity, right? This is someone parachuted from the outside. This isn't one of us, right? And Praectus's case is different because he's grassroots. He actually grew up in the diocese. Yeah.
So in order to continue this, when you talk about somebody who grew up in the same diocese and climbs up the social ladder, this ladder, I'm not sure if I should say social ladder.
Right.
To what extent does he have to have certain cultural competences that enable him to travel this ladder, to create this kind of social capital
Right.
or cultural capital that would make him a candidate for such a position. In other words, I'm asking, and not just specifically in this case, but in general, in this situation where people climb or come from lower strata and climb up,
Right.
what kind of cultural skills do they need to have in order to be part of this game?
Okay. So first of all, I mean, what makes the Passio Projecti and the Vita Eligius so special is that they are very rare cases of people who actually made it, right? So we don't have a lot of these. We do have some, but I mean, overwhelmingly, the Episcopal candidates are from the elite. We can look at the kinds of skills that are brought to bear on daily activity. And in this case, I think rhetorical skills are very valued. So the ability to communicate with your Episcopal colleagues, the ability to write letters, the ability to write hagiography. So literacy skills at a high level are very valued, and I think they are a key to social mobility. And I think I'm thinking of other cases in which the people discussed or weren't necessarily churchmen or weren't necessarily bishops, but they were able to get to the top by leveraging their literacy skills. So people who would write encomia for kings or would write poetry, a very good example is Venantius Fortunatus, who was an Italian poet that came to Merovingian Gaul in the second half of the 6th century and eventually worked his way up until he was the poet to the stars, so to speak. And he would write poetry for kings and queens and princes and princesses and dukes and duchesses and so on. And eventually it paid off because he was made Bishop of Poitiers in 600. So yeah.
So the clowns of this matter without really religious skills or the religious reputation that they have plays an important role?
It's difficult to say because the hagiography tells a very specific story of sainthood, right? It is meant to be used and understood as an exemplum of what you need to aspire to. Okay, so I mean, I don't want to say this is a very cynic portrayal and we should peel off the piety and see what lurks within, because I mean, obviously these were very religious people, so there's no question about it. What kind of religiosity it was, I mean, it's difficult to say, but definitely the two aren't mutually exclusive. So you can be pious and religious and, you know, mortify your flesh and do all of that and still be a very capable networker and very capable with money and a very capable letter writer, sermon writer, and so on. And I mean, if you're a man of many skills, then that works in your advantage, obviously.
Maybe we'll take Jackie's question. Jackie?
We can't hear you. You're muted. Can you unmute?
Yeah.
Okay, we hear you now.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Much of this has been already answered in response to the previous questions. I'm just curious. Okay, if it's being, I mean, my interest is in the way, you know, why hagiographies were written and who are the people listening to them, reading them or listening to them, and how. Are there any ways that we have of tracking that beyond emendations in manuscripts to see, well, you know, you say, okay, you had to change the situation because it reflects a social situation that's no longer current, you have to revise this. How does one research this? How does one know what kind of impacts a hagiography will have?
Okay, that's a great question, and obviously not a question I can exhaust in a few minutes, but I can say several things. First of all, manuscript work is invaluable. For us to realize what reception certain composition had, we look at the spread of manuscripts. If we see that the manuscripts are primarily centered on monastic centers of production, then we can speculate that the distribution of this work was primarily monastic. There are also phrases within the Latin that indicate who the readership might have been. So when the hagiographer opens with dear brothers, okay, then we can, or dear sisters, then we can say maybe it was written for a, for a monastic audience. Certainly the level of the Latin, okay, some hagiographies are written in what is known as sermo humilis, so a Latin that is readily understandable to the laity, okay? And here we see the employment of rhythmic and mnemonic devices to allow the laity to commit these hagiographies to memory. Okay, there's a lot of work about how to make hagiographies more convincing and more alive in a sense by using all kinds of narrative strategies, such as allusions to to bucolic scenes, to scenes from nature, to the sensorium of the early medieval world. So talking about the chirping of birds and the blossoming of flowers. So using metaphors and similes that allow these contents to resonate with the laity. In monastic contexts and clerical contexts, we see the use of biblical allusions, sometimes pretty obscure biblical allusions, and we know that these are kinds of cues in the text that only people who are biblically literate would catch on, right? And there's so much more that I could say, but I think that's a good start.
I just wanted to add to this point that there is cultural translation and there's translation into vernaculars afterwards.
Right.
Where we can see quite clearly what happened, and even we have so-called Jewish adaptations from the vernaculars, even if the vernacular manuscripts are later. So we have Jewish listeners to hagiographic stories. At Regensburg, for example, somebody's listening to the story told at the holy site, and so on, and Jews are reflecting in their Hebrew script now the story and the techniques of the story in Hebrew hagiography.
Okay.
On their own.
And we must remember that with hagiography, there is an entire material world that is associated with the cult of the saint, and this is the cult of the relics. Okay, so the relic could be something pretty fancy, like the body of the saint, right? But it can be something very small, like a cluster of hair, a strand of fabric, even a nail or something like that. And usually these came with cult, like relic catalogs, okay? Because, a church has, I don't know, several dozen artifacts, right? But after a few generations, no one remembers whose nail this is, whose lock of hair this is. So we get catalogs, long catalogs. Okay, in shelf 3D, you have the ingrown toenail of Saint Priactus. In shelf 3E, you have the rotten tooth of some other guy, right? And then we see that the people guarding these relics say something like, and all the rest of the relics that we have been lost to time, and only God can say who these relics belong to, but we pray to these saints nonetheless, right? So we have to realize that there is a literary stratum, but there is also a very practical stratum to the cult of saints that is involved in healing miracles and processions and festivals and so on. So this is a live phenomenon. It's just not just a textual phenomenon. Okay.
That's an important comment.
Angela.
That's okay.
Angela, can you hear us? You can ask.
Yes, yes, I can hear you. I'm sorry that I can't use video. It will destroy my connection. But thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering a little bit about Eligius's attitude towards magic, which is well documented, I think, that he's not a fan. Sorry, the dog. But I was curious about something in his life that always puzzled me, and that is about amulets for animals. Do any of these survive? And what does that have to do maybe with Eligius's relationship with the countryside or with his kind of humble upbringing? Do you think he ever made any of these amulets and then later took a stand against it?
The question of whether amulets are permitted or forbidden is usually related to the person producing them. Okay, so I can give a parallel story from Gregory of Tours, who says, some people under my care came down with a certain disease. Okay, and then they went to the healing woman in the village, and they asked her to, I don't know, to heal my pigs of their disease or to heal my warts or whatever. And we see that actually in the level of what is practiced, right, the things that are prescribed by this healing woman are no different than the things that Gregory himself prescribes as bishop. They're usually, they take strands of like parchment and write biblical passages on them and bind them with ligatures to the affected limb. So if somebody has a limp, then they would find an appropriate passage from the Bible and they would tie it to their leg, and hopefully that would. So this is the same practice, whether it's some healing lady or the bishop, but it only works for the bishop, right? In Gregory's books, at least, because the bishop is the one speaking from authority, whereas this illiterate lady from the countryside is a usurper of this authority. Okay, so that might explain Eligius's ambivalence towards this practice. It's always a question of kind of like a give and take, right? He is in a northern, very remote diocese, so one might assume that pagan survivals and so on, or at least common practices that are not sanctioned by the church, are going on all the time, which we know. So we might assume that some agricultural miracles were called for, and that Eligius was approached to perform these miracles, and that maybe these artifacts that were produced by him were, were under guarantee, and so not as opposed as ones produced by someone else. But I mean, that's the best I can do, I guess.
The one thing that was always fascinating to me is that well, not fascinating, but he does, at least the life indicates that even if clerics make these amulets, they are not to be used because they're devilish in nature or something. So I was always wondering if he was being asked to make such things or not.
But this might be a good indication of thinking about a layer that was introduced into the hagiography later, because when we see Carolingian councils, they are busy with these things exactly. And so this wasn't so much a preoccupation of the Merovingian councils. So possibly this would have been inserted later into the hagiography to reflect the changing standards of ecclesiastical behavior.
But it definitely was still there for Caesarius, right? I mean, I think he was the one. He also hated these magic things, and I think we have it in his voice. But you're probably right that the kind of obsession about it came maybe later.
Caesarius, I mean, it's dangerous to make too much of Caesarius. I think Caesarius requires of his congregation a standard of Christian living that is all but impossible, right? He wants to control their mind 24/7. He tells them, you need to think about this and you need not to think about that. And I think the adverse reaction of the community to Caesarius's legacy after he died under the episcopacy of Aurelian is good indication that Caesarius was not successful ultimately in bringing these things about. But it's difficult to say.
Thank you.
Okay. There's a comment.
Jackie.
Is it?
Reminds one of the book of Acts in which the sons of Sceva, a high priest, uses kerchiefs and try to cast out demons in the name of Jesus Christ, who Paul preaches. The demons come out with a frightening scream saying, Paul, I know, and Jesus, I know, but who are you?
Right. This is just like Rumpelstiltskin, right? When you know the demon's name, then you have some authority over him. There's a funny story from the life of the Jura Fathers. So this is a monastery that was built not too far from the city of Besançon, if you know where that is. Now it's the heart of the Swiss watch industry. And so there was an abbot living in one of these monasteries who took a vow of stability. So he would not leave the monastery for anything, right? But then he received a letter from one of his aristocratic female patrons. And she says, listen, Ugandis, I'm suffering terribly from a demon, from a demonic affliction. You need to do something about this. Come help me. But he's like, well, I can't really leave the monastery. So what do I do? Well, he sits down and he writes the demon a very strict letter. And he sends this, and the woman reads the letter, and of course the demon is impressed enough to leave, but just to make sure that he doesn't come back, she rips a piece of the letter and chews it and swallows it as a like a prophylactic of sorts. Okay, so yeah, controlling demons is definitely a part of this activity, although what demons and demoniacs can tell us about Merovingian society is really fascinating, and I think it's a topic for another talk. But I can say a lot about that.
Can I still chip in? Okay. Thanks very much, Yaniv. It was really interesting, and there's so many questions, and yeah, some of them answered my questions also. A comment is that, of course, it's not a revelation, but it's striking how many common motives one can find between hagiographies of different cultures and different periods.
Of course.
So I've been working on for my master's on a little hagiographical text, also reflecting rural sheikhs, and we have really some similar stories, but also what I always like to tell about this text is that it's a rare reflection of rural life. And you were more insistent on the fact that of class in those stories. So is it also a rarity to find this reflection of rural life? This is one of my questions. A second is a more technical question. We've had a very nice sort of slides, but none of them went back to your period, if I'm correct.
Right.
So is it impossible to find images from the Merovingian period that?
Right. So we have about 10 times as many surviving manuscripts from the year 750 to 900 than we do from 500 to 750. So to find manuscripts from my period is difficult, and to find ones that contain visuals that are relevant to my talk is impossible. There's archaeology. You can kind of play around a little bit with that. I showed a liturgical vessel from Anglo-Saxon England. But yeah, you're right. So forgive me for that. I mean, as far as venturing outside the city, yes, there are instances in hagiographies of things that happen outside the city.
Or in other types of literature.
In other types of literature, I mean, that depends how far you want to stretch the word literature, because contracts of estates, rural estates, like Carolingian census have a lot of detail about things that are going on outside. Some things in monastic archives, like the Gesta of abbots, contain some information about rural, but they're not very narrative sources. So in order to get kind of an action-based, personality-based portrayal of things going on outside the city, you need to either turn to historiography or hagiography. Those are the main ones, or poetry, right? Poetry does have all kinds of like very serene bucolic scenes. Venantius Fortunatus has a song about the garden of one of the Merovingian princesses, and he walks in the garden and hears the chirping of the birds and smells the flowers and so on. So there are these things, but I think hagiography is the best avenue into figuring out the dynamics between the rural and the urban centers. There are also suburban, like liminal spaces. So for instance, the graveyards, right? So the graveyard is a liminal space between the city and the countryside. So I'm not talking about the special dead, the saints that whose bodies find their way into the city. I'm talking about, just run-of-the-mill dead people, right? So they're buried in the cemetery, and the cemetery, it's like you don't necessarily know when you're out of the city. You're kind of transitioning into this intermediate stage where you're between the tombs, and people are living between these tombs. There are homeless people, there are schizophrenics, there are all kinds of monks, all kinds of liminal characters walking around between these tombs. And it's not surprising to find saints cults emerging organically in these places, such as the cult of Saint Benignus. So Gregory of Tours tells a story of a sarcophagus, a very impressive sarcophagus. Nobody knew who was inside the sarcophagus, but the rurals would meet and would say, you want to meet me near the sarcophagus, or let's meet near the sarcophagus and shake on a deal, or maybe make a pledge or a vow. And so the bishop was kind of uneasy with this. So he had the choice whether to oppose actively or whether to appropriate, right? And this is what he did. He chose the latter. And how did he do this? He obviously had a useful dream, telling him that the person in this sarcophagus is actually Benignus. And all of a sudden, miraculously, a hagiography of Benignus appears. And so he is able to swallow up and incorporate this cult. So hagiography is also a way of, sending out kind of feelers into the countryside and seeing where your authority kind of runs out. Okay. Is this another? No, this is an old comment.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you.